Whether it's you celebrating your favorite Indian festival, whether it's clearing your exams with the highest possible marks, or whether it is a newborn baby being welcomed into a family. For every occasion in India, you have a sweet that you share and you have with your loved ones. And which is why when you talk about Indian culture and the different flavors and colors of India, sweets are a very important component of that. Whether it's the peda from North India, whether it's the Rasagulla of East India, whether it's the Puran Poli from the West, or whether it's the Mysore Pak from the South, every region in India represents the diversity, not just of its culture, but also of its culinary and sweet eating traditions. So, to talk about this very interesting and salivating topic today, I have with me a very special guest, Bhaskar Menon, who runs Mala Akbari. Welcome to the show, Bhaskar. Namaste.
Namaste, Vineet. Thank you so much for such a nice and sweet I have to say introduction. Yes, so my name is Bhaskar Menon, and I've started a chain of restaurants called Mala Akbari, which basically serves something called historical Indian food. Now, the concept is that what were we eating in the past? Um, how do we know about those dishes? And so that's what we want to kind of showcase at our restaurant. Today, I think we'll be talking mostly about sweets. So, of course, we'll talk about that. But just to give you a small background, so we are based in Gurgaon. That's where we opened our first restaurant, and now we have opened our second restaurant in Delhi also, in at Ambience Mall, Vasant Kunj. The restaurant serve food and alcoholic beverages from the history of India. They are based on books such as these that tell us about our food history, and we serve dishes that are not authentic dishes as they are called, but they are actually dishes that you will not find anywhere else because people have stopped cooking them because they may be from the Nimatnama text that's 500 years old, or they may be from a text called the Manasolas from 900 years ago. Now, the second part also is that they are based on ingredients that are pre-Columbian exchange, or ingredients that were before Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. What were we eating in the subcontinent, that is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, or historical India, before chilies, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, cashew nuts, papaya, corn came to India? So, of course, our food was very different. The subcontinent was always a land of spices, not a land of chili. And that's what we want to showcase at our restaurant. Sugar is a big part of our concept and our cuisine because, I'm not one of those people who wants to say that India invented everything. But one of India's biggest exports of all time, be it culinary or anything else, and I think it can be a great soft power, utensil that Indians can use, is that we invented sugar. So without Indians, there would be no sugar anywhere in the world. Now, when I say we invented sugar, of course, the sugarcane plant was not first grown in India. It's originally from Papua New Guinea. Sometime around 5 or 6 thousand years ago, the seeds came into India, and around uh, 3,000 years ago, Indians started cultivating the sugarcane plant for the first time. And around uh, 3,000 years ago, so that's around 1000 BCE. You can say that is at the beginning of the early Vedic period. Um, Indians started making jaggery from sugarcane juice called shakkara. So that is the start of how sugar was made. And sugar is something that is truly Indian. We'll speak more about it. I will tell you about how the word sugar also comes later. And later, maybe we can also try. I think I will not move the laptop screen, but we can try some of these desserts as well that we have from the restaurant that are based on the food history of India.
Bhaskar and the people who are watching this show, please pardon me if my attention wavers because if such dishes are going to be, and I have a sweet tooth myself, I'm going to find it very hard to focus. So I'll try.
you
But
have you have to come to the
uh,
restaurant and try the dishes, of course.
absolutely, I plan to do that whenever I come next to Delhi. So yeah.
Yes.
Uh, so Firstly, what were the earliest documentation of Indian deserts, right? What were the some of the books and texts where these were first quoted or cited?
So the I think it's behind me right here. So in the Indus Valley civilization, there is no mention of sugar. The Rig Veda does not mention sugar, but it mentions madhu. So madhu in Sanskrit is sweet. In fact, there's a dish called the madhu apupa, which in fact we can try later. It's right in front of me, which we make, which is a barley pancake that was apparently fried in ghee, soaked in sugar syrup, and had with som by the gods. And that's a dish mentioned in the Rig Veda or the Rig Veda. It's made with honey, and it kind of shows that the Rig Veda is apparently supposed to have been, composed around 1500 BCE, so 3500 years ago. So it shows that maybe sugar at that time was not, had not been cultivated or not been made at that time yet. So the first text that actually mentions sugar is the Atharva Ved. It mentions the chewing of sugar. The Arthashastra by Chanakya, which is not as old but 2,250 years old, mentions sugar as well. Megasthenes, who wrote the Indica when he came to India with Seleucus Nicator, mentions that Indians make honey without bees, and there are large blocks of like rocks that look like frankincense, and they are sweeter than honey or date palm syrup, is what they say. But for foreigners, they could not, imagine a man-made natural sweet substance. So the Chinese and the Greeks called it honey without bees, because they couldn't imagine something that was like sugar. And that is something that's why it is truly Indian. We, just like we made zero and nobody else could imagine it, sugar was something like that. It was something that is as important as salt in the world. It drove the world round, and it is something that till 300 years ago was only probably, or at least majorly, made in India. So there are texts that mention it going back almost 3,000 years, but the proper mentions first come around 2,200 years ago.
It's interesting that you say that. So we produced honey, but not through bees.
No,
So
no, no,
that probably came much
no.
later. That
The
is
foreigners
what you're
could
trying to
not
say.
understand what is sugar. See, the like salt comes from a natural substance, right? It comes from, you get it from the banks of oceans,
Correct.
right? Like at the
Correct.
Rana and everything. But sugar is a man-made substance.
Correct.
You cannot find sugar naturally
Yeah.
in nature. You have to boil sugarcane juice,
Correct.
and what you get as a residue is sugar. So foreigners could not understand. They had not seen that process
Right.
maybe. So when they tasted it, they thought it's a natural substance. So that's why they called it honey without bees, because they could not understand what is sugar.
Oh, like that. But what about honey and jaggery itself? Is there any history to those also in India?
Jaggery is sugar. So sugar, what we think of sugar today, because we have completely been westernized, we think of the refined white sugar. The original shakkara is actually brown jaggery. So I'll just show you the process of how sugar is made. You have the sugarcane plant. When you crush this, you get, sugarcane has a lot of water in it, right? Now the water contains a lot of glucose. So when you crush this bamboo, like it's the same family as bamboo, um, you crush it, and the liquid that comes out of it is a very high glucose liquid. When you take that is this liquid actually. So this is sugarcane juice. So when you boil, it's a very sweet juice. When you boil this, right, um, you basically get, and when it boils, when the liquid is evaporated, you get jaggery, which is this, right? Um, it can also look like this because it's lost all its liquid. If you refine this, it becomes this, which is white sugar. This white sugar, for the first time, was actually only made 1500 years ago. So this is not as old as jaggery, right? Um, Now, you can also alternatively, from jaggery, you can also make molasses by adding. So, if you boil jaggery with water, you will get molasses, which does not go bad. It stays a long time, and you could. It's an easier medium to add to a lot of things. But the issue with this is that it can also harbor a lot of impurities. Obviously, the browner the substance, the more impurities it has. Now, if you can also add bleach and make white sugar, I'm not saying that, but generally proper refined sugar is with the least amount of impurities. You could also say it takes away all the good things that jaggery has, and that's how you get refined sugar. So refined sugar was something that, it's the history is uncertain, but it was first made by the Chinese actually, because in the 6th and 7th century, the Tang dynasty was very interested in the process of Indians making sugar. So Hyun Sang in the 6th century AD had come to India. Actually, sorry, the 7th century AD had come to India, to Harshvardhan's court, to find the land of God, because Buddhism was an export from India to China. So they wanted to see the land of Buddhism. But along his travels, he also found that Indians were consuming this substance that was honey without bees. Right. So basically, when they came, they found that Indians were, you know, having this. They took it back to China. The second time around, he came on his second trip. He found that Harshvardhan was no more. Right, the Buddhist stupas were kind of scattered, and Buddhism was on the decline in India. But very interestingly, Indians were having more of the sugar substance. So he took it back to China. The history is, but it is an uncertain history, that they reverse engineered white sugar, brown sugar, and they created white sugar. It came back to India, and what was it called? What is white sugar in Hindi?
Chini.
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 So that is the etymology of white
Oh,
sugar.
okay.
In the 1200s, actually in the 800s to the 900s, when Arabs came to India for the first time, they also found that Indians were, producing a lot of sugar. They took it to the center of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Fatimid Caliphates at that time, and they tried to produce their own sugarcane in the Nile River Delta. The soil is little. It produces a little thicker kind of, the sugarcane is plant is not the same, so the liquid produces a little bit different. So the you get a thicker kind of a sugar, which is a little bit more starchy, as they say. So the final substance is also thicker white refined sugar. It came back to India, and can you tell me what the name was of that? What is Egypt in
Misr.
Hindi? Misr, right? So it was Mishri,
Oh,
right?
okay.
And if we talk about the etymology of sugar itself, so shakkara in Sanskrit becomes sheker in Farsi, sheker in Turkish. If you just look at the map, um,
Sucre.
sucre in French, and sugar in English, zucchero in Italian. So the etymology of sugar comes from shakkar ultimately. Um, as a child, or and even now, I'm sure you like eating candies. So in Haryanvi, in Punjabi, and in Hindustani, the word for blocks of sugar is khand or khand. So in the 1800s, when the British came here, they found that Indians were obviously having khand or khand, and in English it became
Candy. Wow.
candy. That's right. So most sugar substances have their etymologies in relation to Sanskrit or other Indian languages, because obviously it came from here. Now, the other thing that you can say is that, the sugar that we mostly eat today comes from three things. It comes from either the sugarcane plant, which is the original way of making sugar. That is what Indians invented. But now the Americans have found a cheaper way of making sugar, and that is through corn, because corn has a lot of sugar in it as well. and it requires less water to grow and everything. So through maize. So that's called high fructose corn syrup. Um, then you also have the sugar beet, um, which in Southeast Asia and everywhere is it also produces a lot of sugar. So in once the industrial revolution happened, once the European age of colonization began, they found, similar climates to grow sugar, and that's how in Cuba and Brazil sugar became such a big industry. And I think it was just last year when finally India, dethroned Brazil as a number one producer of sugar after a long time in its almost 3,000 years of history of making sugar.
Wow, very interesting. Can you provide an overview of like the significance of desserts generally in Indian cuisine, and like in terms of how sweets are perceived in the West versus how they are perceived in India? Like in terms of cultural significance, how exactly does sugar based food like halwai or mithai, whatever you call that, how does it differ in India and abroad?
So that's a very good question, and it's something that's very interesting also. So interestingly, in India and China, where also for a long time they have been making something like sugar. You cannot call it sugar, but something like sugar from non-sugarcane substances, like from fruits, for example. So, and in India and China, there is no concept of having dessert actually. You can start a meal with sugar as well. In Rajasthan, for example, dal bati churma is mixing jaggery with dal and with bati, right? In Kerala, when you have a sadhya, you start with the shakkara uperi. So you can, in India, there is no concept of having dessert or sugar last. Now, I mean, you can also tell me, imagine you have 100 rupees to spend on a particular meal, right? And the most expensive part of a meal costs 50 rupees and everything else costs 10 rupees each. So, will you buy the most of that 50 rupees or will you buy the least amount for that 50 rupees? Obviously, the least amount. So, in Europe, because sugar was always an imported commodity, and obviously, if you're importing, the further away the place that you're importing from, and if there are many middlemen in the middle, the price obviously becomes higher as the product goes along. Now for Europe, if you take, let's say, Portugal and Spain, India and China were the furthest away trading nations, because after Portugal and Spain, it's only the Atlantic Ocean, right? So sugar became really expensive by the time it reached Europe, and because of that, um, the 50 rupees product was a sugary substance or sugar itself, and that's why sugar had to be eaten in very small amounts at the end of a meal in Europe. It was never eaten at the beginning of a meal. So whereas, what are called halwais or moiras, in different names. Halwai is not a historical name because halwa itself is not originally Indian. Moiras could be a old historical name. um, have existed in the subcontinent for 3,000 years, since the beginning of sugar, obviously, right? But confectionery producers, or people who deal, pastry chefs or people who deal in production of sugar in Europe, have not been there for more than 3 or 400 years, because they didn't produce sugar. So how could they make substances with sugar? Yes, they did make desserts. The Roman Empire did have desserts, but all their desserts were made with honey, not with sugar, because honey was available everywhere. So you had honey based cakes, honey based biscuits. But again, honey, even in India, is expensive because honey occurs, you have to get some bee hive to take out the honey from. So it's very
Cultivation.
risky. Cultivation is tough. And you don't, I mean, how many beehives can you harvest? I mean, without modern technology, you can't make bees reproduce on purpose, right? So earlier it was all nature doing the work. So you probably had years where there was no honey at all. So sugar is something that is special to India, and the production of sugar, since it's so long, we have had those sugar producers for a long time. The exact name, as I said, maybe Moira is an old name in Bengal that has been used for a long time. There's a mention of a Moira who's produced Sandesh from 1851 in Bengal. K.C. Das obviously made Rasgulla for the first time in 1867. Um, but an exact term for a sugar maker, I would say, is something maybe I also have to check. But so far in my research, I have not found a person who just makes sweets,
Okay.
dating back more than Halwa, you could say.
What is the role of a Moira or a Halwai or an Indian sweet shop in terms of you know the evolution of sweets? What role have they played? And have they always been like these small establishment, family run kind of places?
See, again, Indians are not great at keeping records. So before the Europeans came to India, you can't talk about shops or how shops were kept, because maybe the Mughal Empire has some records of how about how shops were kept. In the south, in the Sangam literature or in Vijayanagara literature, you'll have some odd story of a shopkeeper selling coconut burfis or something like that. But in the old text, so if you just talk about textual sources of any kind of food from India, if you talk about the Mana Solas from 1129 or the Lok Pakara or the Nimatnama, they these are all texts that were written by the kings, and they were kind of sweets were made for the gods, for example. They were giving us prasadam in temples. Whether they were sold to people on the streets is something that is not mentioned anywhere at all. The super shastra, nothing of this sort is mentioned anywhere. Of course, after the 1850s, I think, as shopkeepers selling items that were made of sugar, I think the British have kept very good records of it. The Portuguese have kept, the French have kept very good records in India, as any kind of shopkeeper, selling his wares. So before that, I would say that a lot of dishes are mentioned in very rudimentary sense, kind of terms. Like, for example, in the Manasolas, the Purika is mentioned as, and historians think that it is the origin of the Puran Poli in Maharashtra, for example. Or the Sirika is mentioned, and people think that it's the origin of the Shrikhand. um, in the Rig Veda, interestingly, actually, the apupa that I was talking about and that I showed you was made by someone called a apuparik, and an apuparik was a baker. So looks like there was a profession of a baker who produced apupas that people now think are the modern malpuas. So, of course, I think since we've had currency in the subcontinent for more than, since the Indus Valley civilization of sorts, um, there must have been some kind of trade, whether it was barter or through, modern monetary, coins or whatever, for something that somebody made and sold. Whether how they lived and what their livelihood was, that is questionable. Also, were they selling these sweets in urban areas, also is questionable. But for sure, like, desserts have been made in India for a very, very long time. There have been many kinds. And one more thing that sugar does is that when you mix it and make it into a syrup, it makes the food last longer. So sugar was not only added for taste, you have to see, it was also added for the food not catching fungus. It
Preservative.
elongates the, exactly, it's a preservative. It reduces the kind of the wastage, and it makes the food last longer.
Interesting. You mentioned about Roshagulla. Was it invented in Bengal or Odisha? Where is the jury?
Don't ask me that. Please, I'm not going to answer this question at all. Was it invented in the Puri Jagannath temple or by K.C. Das? This is something that you don't want to get me in. I'm not going to get into this. I'm not a Uru or a Bengali myself, so I'm not going. I don't have sides to take. I'm not going to get into this very, very dangerous debate. Please keep me out of this. I'll just say that I love Rasgulla, and we'll get on with that.
You
And I have the sibling of Rasgulla, which is very different, of course, but I have the Gulab Jamun here.
you just deflected a Bengal versus Odisha war now. So great.
I'm not getting into that. I'm sorry, but you cannot put me into this very, very dangerous debate.
And by the way, was the Mysore Pak invented in Mysore?
That is something I have to check, but I can say that one of the interesting things about the Mysore Pak is that it is roasted. So it is one of the rare Indian desserts that is actually roasted, not fried, not steamed, but roasted.
Interesting. Okay. Uh, Also, how did the like? What is the culture of sweet making in India like? Uh, I've always wondered this. Who have been like the pioneers? Is it like in terms of royal cooks and kitchens? Have how
Yeah.
what kind of contribution have the royal kitchens played in kind of developing the sweet appetite in the country? Like how much have they contributed to it? Any interesting
I think
examples? And very importantly, have there been any emperors who have had a huge sweet tooth?
I think it's a great question because I think one of the things that you said right now, you said the culture of India. So I think that is where it's a very interesting way of saying it because I mean, India is a land of many countries in a way. Every state is more diverse than a country, or if it were a country on its own. So the culture of Punjab and the culture of Kerala is so different that it might as well be the difference between, let's say, South Africa and Italy. And why I'm saying that is because yes, sugar is a common product that is used in both states. But can you find a Gond ka laddu in Kerala, or can you find an Ada Payasam in Punjab? So um, the thing is that the culture of dessert and the culture of our sweets and the culture of and the history of these sweets in each state is influenced by a lot of things. So uh, Rasgulla is made from chena, right? Um, Many North Indian desserts are made from are milk-based desserts, but a lot of North Indian desserts, like I have over here, the zulbia, or the what is the origin of the jalebi, the original Iranian version of the jalebi, is not Indian. So what happened was that in the 11 and 1200s, when sugar went to the Middle East, I think they developed a very good sweet tooth as well. And I think, as I said, in the heat of the Middle East, in drier conditions, sugar lasts very well. What salt does is that it makes the water go, out from any product that it's put into, whereas sugar does something like that, but nothing compared to salt. So sugar is a great preservative, and as I said, in many cultures there is no distinction between a dessert and a savory item. So you could be putting sugar in something that is savory as well, right? Like if you go to Indonesia, you have the kecap manis, and they put in nasi goreng, which is a fried rice. It's a little sweet, but I mean, for them, there is no distinction between it being sweet or salt. Like they don't think of savory food that it cannot have sweet, like a Gujarati or Bengali cuisine, you know. So I think uh, there are many different aspects to why Indian desserts are so different from each other in different parts of India, and that's why you can say that like the culture of desserts in different states is very different to each other. Now, whether did any emperor or king in the past have a sweet tooth? I could say that, of course, like in the Oud state or in Awadh today, there were many Nawabs who are said to like sweets a lot. They had their halwas and their kheers. Um, there is the story of Krishna Devaraya who loved payasam. And as I said again, sweet was something that I think they say that sugar is more addictive than cocaine. So I think Indians have always loved sweets. So I think kings and paupers alike loved their sweets. In the Mughal Empire, although there were a lot of what was called sheer dana and desserts, um, again sugar was added to a lot of savory items as well. Where the Mughals originally come from Uzbekistan, in their pilav, on their plov as it's called, they add sugar with carrots into their plov. Again, maybe if you add sugar to meat, it lasts longer. There are dishes from Awadh that have halwa that are made with sugar. So you could be eating meat, a goat meat halwa, that is made with sugar. So you will not know that it's goat meat, but the reason of making it, I don't know. I'm sure that meat was always more expensive than grain, but maybe it was something that the rich wanted to have. So a favorite in Lucknow is by of many Nawabs is a goat meat halwa. And again, in the east and in the south, sugary desserts are very famous. Now, an interesting part of India where there is less research, but there are not a lot of desserts that have been are not a big part of the cuisine, is the northeast. Now, why that is interesting. If you go to Manipur or Nagaland or Meghalaya or Arunachal Pradesh, sugar is not a big part of their cuisine, and they are very fertile places. They have a lot of sugar. You can grow sugarcane easily there. Now, why was not a big part of their cuisine? It's interesting. You can say that alcohol is something that is less taboo there. To make alcohol, sugar is a very important ingredient, so it's used like that. But why it's not a big part of the cuisine is an interesting factor. And also interesting factor, if you look at Indian desserts compared to Western desserts, is why Indian desserts much sweeter than Western desserts. Whenever people from Western cultures or even China, the Far East, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia eat Indian desserts, they always say Indian desserts are so sweet. But maybe it's related to the fact that although India is 142nd in the world, or 139th in the world in purchasing power parity or nominal GDP per capita income, but we're right up there with any developed country in per capita sugar consumption. In fact, middle class Indians consume more sugar than Americans. So why that is maybe related to that, that we've just had this whole culture of consuming sugar. And even though we're not a so-called very rich country, we're a lower middle income country, we're a developing country, diabetes is as big a problem in the subcontinent. In fact, in Pakistan, it's one of the biggest problems, as it is in Europe. And comparatively, if you look at African countries or countries with similar standard of livings and indices, the subcontinent fares way worse when it comes to things like um, issues related to sugar. So it's always just been a part of our culture, and we've just it's everything that India is, or the majority of India is, revolves around sugar.
So you mentioned that in Europe, especially because it was a very expensive dish, it would probably be a rich person only who can afford it. Would it be right to say then in India it was a very egalitarian consumption of sugar? People across all classes were able to consume it because of this, and also the fact that it was cultivated here since a very long time. So,
Yeah.
was everybody eating sugar, or was it a rich man's? How was that like?
You can't say. I mean, these are very generalized statements. I mean, if I say something right now, it's not going to be correct for sure, because in terms of, like, let's say that it was an egalitarian uh, product, because historically there were famines almost every 5 years anywhere in the world. The life expectancy anywhere in the world was around 27 years of age. So I think anything at any time, the demand supply could go up and down. So you can't say that it was a rich man's dish or a poor man's dish. There is no kind of record of anything like this as well in the past. There have been no foreigners who've come to India and said that the poor people were also eating sugar or the rich people were also eating sugar. So there's no record of anything like that. But for sure, like, was it more widely consumed in the subcontinent compared to the West? Of course, we produced it. So if it's the land of produce, will obviously consume it much more than abroad. I mean, is petrol cheaper in Doha today compared to India? Is gasoline more cheap in Dubai compared to India? I mean, it's the same answer. Obviously, if you produce it, it's cheaper there. So, I mean, but was it a rich man's dish or a poor man's dish? Is something that, I mean, you can't make. I mean, it's difficult to make a statement like that.
Okay. And anything about the royal kitchens? Any famous khansamas or cooks, who uh, did something innovative with sweets and, anything like that?
So as I was telling you, I mean, if you go before the British, so before the 1850s, let's say the max you could take it to 1775 or 1770s, there were very less records of any kind of food. And even if there were records of the food, there were no records of the people who made those dishes. So you could say that in the Nimatnama, Gyat Shahi, who wrote the book Love Sweet, so you could say that his chefs were probably big producers of sugar, or sugar dishes. You could say that Someshwara the second, who wrote the Mana Solas, or whose court it was composed in, obviously his cooks must have been big, sugar makers, or they must have made dishes with sugar. And any kind of text from history, you could say the author is the only person you can look at. So in any kind of Indian history, there are very few places where the people who are actually um, a part of that event are named. So it's difficult to point out like that. I can, like, if you look at, I mean, the way to look at Indian history in terms of like sweet dishes is to look at the ingredients, because I think that's what sets us apart. Like I said, of course, the main ingredient being sugar itself, but then if you look at side ingredients that are related to sugar products and the origin of those dishes, um, is something that you can look at interestingly. I am kind of going off on another tangent. I know you have other questions, but I'll just say this because I think it's something that I think like your viewers would be interested to know as well. Because I mean, as I was talking about the zulbia or the jalebi, um, the history of North India and the history of sugar are very related, even more than savory dishes, because I mean, after the 800s, when people from the Middle East came into India, and the north of India was heavily influenced by Persianate culture, the cuisine also really changed. In terms of savory food, yes, there were influences like kebabs or biryani and everything. But the main part of the cuisine that was really influenced, and where you can really see a connection of North Indian cuisine and Persian cuisine, is desserts. You look at faluda. Faluda is something that in Iranian just means falude are just noodles. Zulbia comes from the word zalabia, in which in Arabic means round. Um, except for laddus, um, there are no North Indian desserts that have actually survived, even in terms of names. So if you look at kheer, the word kheer is from the word sheer, in which in Farsi means milk. The original word in Sanskrit would be payesh, which survives in South India as payasam.
Python.
So, I mean, from Maharashtra onwards, you have very old historical Indian desserts. But in the north, mostly, most desserts are actually not more than 500 or 600 years old, because it was under the Mughals, the Delhi Sultanate, and the various sultanates that a lot of desserts became kind of very influenced by Central Asia and the Middle East. So I have a baklava, for example, in front of me that is super interesting. And although baklava is not a very famous dessert in India today, the Mughals did get it. It didn't catch on. Maybe the heat didn't let the phyllo pastry stay, or it was difficult to make phyllo pastry in India. But baklava is essentially a Turkic dessert that the Turks carried with them in long distances. Maybe they carried the pastry and then they added the nuts and whatever. So it's very famous in the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottomans ruled Lebanon and a lot of part of the Levantine, they introduced baklava there. But when they got it to India, interestingly, the Nuska-e Shah Jahani, or Shah Jahan's biography, mentions baklava that is made with dal. And instead of phyllo pastry, they use puris. So the dish is completely made different. It's adapted to Indian cuisine. It didn't catch on, as I say, but it's basically a fusion of puran poli and baklava. So I think um, a lot of North Indian desserts have been changed and are not the original versions of what they are, let's say, historically. South Indian desserts, on the other hand, are what people would have been eating 1,000, maybe 1,500 years ago.
So these North Indian desserts, how different do they taste from their modern variants? Like, is that like if someone actually eats the original ones, because you would know the ingredients and the preparatory style, right? So does it come anywhere close to it, or is it something else altogether, taste wise?
Uh, that's a good question, Vineet. I would say that, like, for example, we have the firni here, which is like any culture in the world that has used rice in some form or another, makes a rice pudding. So a sheer dana, which was in Sanskrit rice pudding, existed. They say it's mentioned in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata also. We call it the firni today with saffron and with rose water. So I would say there are additional ingredients added to the same dish. So it's not very different from the original variant, but slightly different. You could say that adding mawa or dried milk is something also that is a more Middle Eastern influence, because curdling milk was not something that was allowed historically in India. China is the only example of it, but curdling milk was a taboo in Vedic culture. So, for example,
Wow.
gulab jamun would have not been allowed in Vedic culture at all. Gulab jamun itself, the etymology is gulab, gul ab, which means water of the rose, right? Ab is water, gul is rose. So gulab, jamun is the Indian blackberry. So gulab jamuns were made not more than 3 or 400 years ago. They are not very historical, and soaking them in a so soaking pretty much it's pretty much a version of cheese that has been soaked in a sugar syrup, and that is something that Indians just did not do. It was something that is completely a Middle Eastern influence.
Oh, so the syrup bit of it is not at all any, not Indian influence at all.
No, the syrup is Indian, could be Indian. The gulab,
Okay.
the jamun is, I mean, the cheese itself is not Indian.
Okay.
Is not historically now Indian, of course. I
Of
mean, you
course.
don't get gulab jamuns in Iran or Turkey. You get them in India, so it's a fusion creation in India. But like you don't get jalebi in Iran. You get something called zulbiye or lukma, which is the original version, which is a pastry that is soaked in sugar syrup. Sugar syrup, of course. I mean, if you have sugar, if we are the ones who created sugar, of course we had sugar syrup. But gulab, the cheese itself was something that came from abroad. Adding saffron to it could have also come from abroad.
So, what are some unique ingredients or techniques used in Indian dessert making that have been like, that is very uniquely Indian?
I would say that boiling, for example, milk at high temperatures, adding cardamom, adding spices to it is something that is uniquely Indian. I think I would say fried desserts are not uniquely Indian because it's something that came from Iran. But then there are also mentions of something like a vada that are flavored with cardamom and sugar that are mentioned in the manasolas. So you could say that frying is also something that has been there for a very very long time. The apupa, as I mentioned, is made on a tawa. So I think any kind of cooking on a griddle is something that has been there in India for a long time. Soaking in sugar syrup, I would actually say, is originally Indian, that would have gone out from India to somewhere else. um, and I think just eating jaggery on its own, eating a sugar substance on its own post a meal or before eating a meal, is 100% uniquely Indian. So I think that's something that nobody else in the world does, eating a sugar substance on its own, because the rest of the world consumes white sugar. They don't consume jaggery. So white sugar you cannot eat on its own because it's so fine. First of all, you don't get white sugar blocks. I mean, yes,
You
it's
can.
eaten as what is called candy today, but nobody eats white sugar blocks as much as we eat jaggery today. So I would say most cooking techniques the world over are the same. And in terms of sugar production, you could probably take, after boiling sugar, taking the hairs of sugar out, and making, for example, son papdi. That is something that could be very interestingly Indian, but then they say that it could have also originated in
Oh,
Iran.
that's interesting. Uh, are there any good, interesting stories or folk tales or legends associated with any of the Sweet dishes, like anything interesting that stands out.
To my mind, if I have to say, I would say actually can't think of any, but I do know that I'm not getting the name, but I do know that in when Sandesh was made in Bengal, uh, they would name the Sandesh after like famous people from all over the world. So they would name the Sandesh after Churchill or after Soviet Union leaders. Why they did that, I don't know, but it's something that's interesting. There's also this story that when Humayun lost to Sher Suri in 1542, he went to Shah Tehmasp's court. He was given sugar water with rose water in it, and then they put snow into it, which would have been the people say an original version of ice cream. Uh, then there are also interesting stories of when people came to Muhammad bin Tughlaq's court, and they were before food came, they were served um, glasses of water with like sugar water with rose water in it. And then I think I think interesting stories from all over history are that because water was very dirty in many parts of the world, alcohol was something that was consumed actually not for recreational reasons but actually just because water was dirty. So when European sailors came to India for the first time in the 1500s, they found that on the western coast Indians were drinking something called punch, which was a mix of fruits and some kind of alcohol. And because their own beer used to go flat, they used to consume the Indian punch. And the Indian punch, had a lot of sugar in it. It went back to Europe, and people now consume fruit punch in the West, in America and in Europe, and it's highly influenced by a sweet, sugary, alcoholic beverage that they had in India. Uh, Again, I think the most interesting story, the one I remember the most, is of Megasthenes of Huon Sang calling Indian sugar honey without bees because they just couldn't wrap their mind around a substance that could be made, that is not natural and it's man-made. So I think these are some interesting stories. For sure, I think there are more interesting stories. I'll send them across to you. Maybe you can, you can discuss them with your viewers.
Sure. And you mentioned about Temple Prasadam as well, right? And the Tirupati Laddu is one of the iconic ones.
Exactly. I'm going to talk about the Tirupati Laddu only because I have a lovely book that is on the history of food of Tirupati. There are not a lot of historical records that go more than 200 years, but there are many prasadams that are I mean one of the laddus being one, payasam being another, that are mentioned that are offered to the gods. And just like the apupa that I mentioned earlier, which is a barley pancake soaked in sugar syrup, in honey, and then later soaked in sugar syrup. So these are some things that are mentioned as temple offerings. And then, of course, when Muslims break their fast after Eid, during Ramzan, they have something called kurma, which is essentially a rice-based uh, rice pudding. That is basically just rice that is cooked with sugar. It could be you could add cardamom, you could add saffron. So there are dishes like that.
Any less known trailblazer dishes that that you would know because of the line of work you are in that most people don't know about? Any hidden or something that people need to try? Not very famous.
100%. So, are you a non-vegetarian, Vinny?
Vegetarian, but you can still share.
Vegetarian. I would 100% say I tried it out. I made that mutton halwa. It came out fantastically. So I would say try the mutton halwa if you're a non-vegetarian. Try the egg halwa. It's something that's super super interesting. I would say that try the pupa. It's something that is mentioned in the Rig Veda. It's not made of wheat. It's made of barley, which is now people are calling it very healthy and very good for. It's gluten free, so that's something that one must try. I would say, there are just desserts from all over India that are not eaten as much anymore. So try and make those because I think those are something that you won't get anywhere else. I am a big fan of Ada Pradhamam because I am half
Wow,
a Malayali.
I love it.
So I would say go and try that. I
Yeah.
would say that the pineapple halwa, what is it called? The kesari bhat. So I think these are dishes that are made, but they're very like culture specific. You don't get them outside the culture. Like in Delhi, nobody serves kesari bath except for maybe Andhra Bhavan or something like that. So I think these are some dishes that you must try.
Great. I mean, it's been quite a exhilarating conversation to have, a discussion on this subject. And I mean, I'm really looking forward to coming to your restaurant whenever I'm there in Delhi the next time. Uh,
Yeah,
but one last thing that I want to ask you, because this has been your project that you've taken up for a while now, what
yeah.
really got you into this? And like what made you get into, how did you come to this thing of I want to do a themed restaurant on Indian historical cuisine? It's something so unusual and rare, right? Like,
So the truth is that I'm a very boring guy. I like history a lot, but I also like food a lot. And it's something that I've always been interested in. I have done a hotel management, I have a hotel management degree. So I always wanted to start some kind of a restaurant. And thinking of what I should do, I couldn't leave history behind. It was something that kind of is in my blood. And because I love history so much and food, of course, I thought, why not the best thing be to combine both of these things? Now, the issue was that nobody has ever done something like this before. So I tried to search if there is someone like this anywhere in the world who's combined history and food, but I could not find anybody. And I mean anybody. And even till today, there is nobody. Um, maybe people just thought that it was not commercially a good idea. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a business. But we went out there, we stuck our kind of neck out, and we said, okay, we want to try this out. Make Indians eat food without chili. Make Indians eat different kind of desserts. I would say so far it is successful and people have enjoyed it. And I think you really have to come and try it out. Your viewers have to come and try it out, and only then will they get to know what is the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, as they say. So you have to come and really taste it.
I like the fact that how that is not even a metaphor, but it's the literal truth that you're talking. So,
Right. Exactly.
yeah. So, on that very sweet note, we come to the end of today's show, Bhaskar. It was great having you on the show. Uh,
Thank you so much.
yeah. So, definitely check out Bhaskar's place and go there and have some main course as well as sweets. Until next time, guys, see you around. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.